June 14, 2024, the day the map changed without a single shot fired. That was the day Colonel Douglas. Russia has not only stabilized its position in Ukraine, but it is actively reshaping the geopolitical order in ways that will define the next decade. And yet, if you watched the evening news that night, you'd have heard nothing about it. Instead, you got another segment on Ukrainian drone strikes in Crimea, another round of Russia is running out of missiles, another pundit insisting that just a little more aid would turn the tide. I've spent the last 30 years studying the mechanics of great power competition, and I can tell you when the official narrative and the observable reality diverge this sharply, it's not because the facts are unclear. It's because the facts are inconvenient. And in geopolitics, inconvenient facts have a way of becoming catastrophic failures if they're ignored for too long. So let's start with what they want you to believe. The official war of attrition, a struggling Russia, and the West's moral clarity. The story goes like Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an unprovoked act of imperial aggression, a throwback to the 19th century when great powers carved up smaller nations at will. Vladimir Putin, isolated and paranoid, miscalculated badly, assuming a quick victory, only to find himself bogged down in a quagmire. The West, led by the United States, has rallied in defense of democracy, pouring over $175 billion in military and economic aid into Ukraine, arming it with the most advanced weapons systems in NATO's arsenal. Russia, we're told, is bleeding men, money, and material. Its economy is on the brink of collapse under sanctions. Its military is a hollowed-out shell, resorting to conscripting convicts and the elderly. The war is a stalemate, but time is on Ukraine's side. If only the West stays the course, Russia will eventually crack. That's the version you'll hear from the White House, the State Department, and the editorial boards of the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's a narrative reinforced by carefully curated battlefield: a successful Ukrainian strike here, a Russian ammunition depot blown up there. The message is we're winning. Just a little longer. But there's a problem with this narrative. Actually, there are several. First, the data doesn't support it. Russia's economy didn't just survive Western sanctions, it grew. In 2023, Russia's GDP exited by 3.6%, outpacing the Eurozone and the United States. Its military-industrial complex is operating at a wartime footing, producing artillery shells at a rate 7 times that of the US and Europe combined. And while the West scrambles to ramp up production, Russia has secured steady supplies of critical components, microchips, machine tools, even drones, through a shadow network of neutral states like Turkey, the UAE, and Kazakhstan. Second, the battlefield isn't a stalemate. It's a Russian advance. Slow, methodical, and grinding, but an advance nonetheless. Over the past 6 months, Russian forces have taken Avdiivka, a key Ukrainian stronghold, and are now pushing toward Pokrovsk, a critical logistics hub. Ukrainian casualties are mounting. Some estimates suggest 1,000 men per day in recent weeks, and morale is collapsing. The much-touted Ukrainian counteroffensive last summer failed spectacularly, and now Kiev is on the defensive, its forces stretched thin, its ammunition running low. Third, and most importantly, the war was never just about Ukraine. That's the part the media really doesn't want to talk about. Because if you understand that, you understand that Russia isn't just fighting for territory, it's fighting for the rules of the game. And on that front, it's winning. What's really the return of spheres of influence? Let me tell you something that will make the foreign policy establishment: Russia is not the Soviet Union. It doesn't want to conquer Europe. It doesn't want global revolution. What it wants is something far more dangerous to American hegemony: a return to great power politics as usual. For the past 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could reshape the world in its own image. Democracy promotion, regime change, color revolutions, these weren't just policies, they were articles of faith. The unipolar moment, we were told, was permanent. NATO could extend to Russia's borders without consequence. China could be contained through economic pressure. The rules-based international order was inviolable. Russia, under Putin, has spent the last 2 decades trying to tell Washington that this wasn't sustainable. In 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Putin warned that NATO action was a direct threat to Russian security. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia not because it wanted to annex Tbilisi, but to send to there are limits. In 2014, after the US-backed coup in Kiev, Russia took Crimea and supported separatists in Donbass. Again, the message was, you cross our red lines, we will act. Washington ignored every warning. And now, in 2024, Russia is making its final move. Here's what's really happening in Russia is not just fighting for Donbass or even all of Ukraine. It's fighting to reassert its sphere of influence, a concept that the United States, in its hubris, has spent decades pretending no longer exists. The Kremlin has made it clear that it will not accept a Ukraine that is a Western military outpost. And after 2 years of war, it's becoming equally clear that the West cannot sustain Ukraine indefinitely. The shift the rest of the world has been quietly realigning. The broader geopolitical, the death of unipolarity. I've been warning about this for years, but it's worth the unipolar moment is over. The United States is no longer the sole superpower. It's one of three alongside China and, yes, a resurgent Russia. And the other two are not content to play by Washington's rules. Let's look at the evidence. First, China's rise. Beijing has spent the last decade systematically undermining American dominance in Asia. The Belt and Road Initiative has locked dozens of countries into Chinese economic orbits. The AIIB has challenged the IMF and World Bank. And militarily, China has built a navy larger than the U.S. Pacific Fleet, with capabilities designed to deny America access to the South China Sea. But here's the part that gets lost: in the China and Russia are not just allies of convenience. They are strategic partners with a shared interest in dismantling American hegemony. In February 2022, just days before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin and Xi declared a no-limits partnership. Since then, China has become Russia's economic lifeline, buying its oil, supplying its technology, and providing diplomatic cover at the UN. In return, Russia has become China's military partner, conducting joint exercises in the Pacific and even discussing the possibility of a Chinese naval base in the Arctic. Second, the Global South's defiance. The West assumed that sanctions on Russia would isolate it. Instead, they've isolated the West. India, the world's largest democracy, has tripled its imports of Russian oil. Turkey, a NATO member, has refused to enforce sanctions and has become a critical hub for Russian trade. Saudi Arabia, long a U.S. ally, has cut oil production in coordination with Moscow. Even Brazil and South Africa have refused to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. This isn't just about opportunism. It's about sovereignty. The Global South is tired of being lectured by the West. They see America's wars in Iraq and Libya, its financial crises, its political dysfunction, and they're making a maybe the US isn't the reliable partner it claims to be. Third, the erosion of American deterrence. The US has spent decades building a global network of alliances, from NATO to bilateral defense pacts in Asia. But in the past 2 years, that network has shown cracks. Europe is divided. Hungary and Slovakia oppose further aid to Ukraine, while Germany and France dither over long-term commitments. In Asia, the Philippines and Japan are increasing defense spending, but South Korea and India remain reluctant to fully commit to containing China. And in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are hedging their bets, courting both Washington and Beijing. Russia's war in Ukraine has exposed a fundamental: America's alliances are only as strong as its willingness to fight for them. And after 2 decades of failed wars in the Middle East, the American public is in no mood for another one. The military: why the Hawks are wrong. Now, let's talk about the military situation. Because this is where the disconnect between perception and reality is most dangerous. The hawks in Washington, both in the administration and in Congress, have convinced themselves that this war can be won with more weapons, more money, and more time. They point to Ukraine's drone strikes deep inside Russia, its sinking of Russian warships in the Black Sea, its ability to hold the line in the east. They argue that if we just send ATACMS, F-16s, and long-range missiles, Ukraine can turn the tide. Here's the that's not how modern war works. I've studied every major conflict of the last 50 years, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. And one lesson stands: technology alone doesn't win wars. Industrial capacity does. The side that can produce more artillery shells, more tanks, more drones, that's the side that wins in a war of attrition. And right now, Russia is outproducing the West by a factor of 5 to 1. Let's look at the numbers. Russia is firing 10,000 artillery shells per day. The US and Europe combined are producing about 2,000 per month. Russia has lost thousands of tanks, but it has 10,000 more in storage and it's churning out new ones at a rate of 200 per month. Ukraine, meanwhile, is running out of Soviet-era stockpiles, and Western replacements are arriving too slowly to make a difference. Then there's the manpower issue. Ukraine started the war with a population of 41 million. Today, after 2 years of war, it's closer to 30 million due to deaths, injuries, and mass emigration. Russia, with a population of 143 million, has a far larger pool of recruits. And while Western media focuses on Russia's mobilization problems, the reality is that Russia has adapted. It's offering lucrative signing bonuses, fast-track citizenship for foreign fighters, and even pardons for convicts who serve. The result? Russia is now fielding 300,000 troops in Ukraine, with another 500,000 in reserve. Now, I'm not saying Ukraine can't fight. I'm saying that the math doesn't add up. And the longer this war drags on, the worse the imbalance becomes. The hawks will tell you that we just need to hold the line until Russia collapses. But that's not strategy, that's hope. And hope is not a plan. The domestic political why Washington can't quit Ukraine. So if the military situation is so dire, why does the US keep pouring money into Ukraine? Why does the administration keep insisting that victory is just around the corner? The answer, as always, is politics. Let's start with the 2024 election. President Biden has staked his legacy on Ukraine. He's framed this war as a battle between democracy and autocracy, between the rules-based order and Russian aggression. If he admits that Ukraine is losing, it's not just a policy failure, it's a personal failure. And with Trump looming as the likely Republican nominee, Biden can't afford to look weak on Russia. Then there's Congress. The Republican Party is deeply divided on Ukraine. The establishment, led by figures like Mitch McConnell, sees continued aid as essential to countering Russia. But the populist wing, led by Trump and his allies, has grown increasingly skeptical. They argue that the money should be spent at home, not on a faraway war. The result? A series of messy compromises, with aid packages delayed, watered down, or tied to unrelated issues like border security. And let's not forget the bureaucracy. The Pentagon, the State Department, and the intelligence community have all invested heavily in this war. Careers have been built on the assumption that Ukraine can win. Admitting defeat would mean admitting that they failed. And bureaucracies, as we know, are not in the business of admitting failure. Finally, there's the media. The mainstream press has framed this war as a simple morality: Ukraine equals good, Russia equals evil. Questioning that narrative is heresy. So instead of asking hard questions, why is Ukraine losing? What's the endgame? Is this war winnable? The media focuses on feel-good stories about Ukrainian bravery and Russian atrocities. The result? A feedback loop. The administration insists Ukraine is winning. The media repeats it. The public believes it. And no one in power has an incentive to tell the truth. 3 scenarios for the future, none of them good. So where does this leave us? Let's look at the possible outcomes. Scenario 1, the best case, a frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war grinds to a halt along current lines. Russia consolidates its gains in the east and south, while Ukraine holds onto the west. A ceasefire is declared, but no formal peace treaty is signed. Ukraine becomes a de facto neutral state, like Austria during the Cold War. The West continues to arm Ukraine, but at a reduced level. Russia, satisfied with its territorial gains, shifts its focus to rebuilding its economy and countering China's rise. This is the least bad outcome. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because neither side has an incentive to stop fighting. Ukraine can't accept losing territory. Russia can't accept a hostile government in Kiev. And the West can't accept a Russian victory without losing face. Scenario 2, the most likely, a slow Russian victory. In this scenario, the war drags on for another 12 to 18 months.
Ukraine's defenses gradually collapse as manpower and ammunition run low.
Russian forces push westward, capturing more territory.
The West, facing domestic pressure and election year politics, reduces aid. Ukraine's government collapses or is forced into negotiations. Russia imposes a settlement on its Ukrainian neutrality, demilitarization, and recognition of Russian control over Crimea and Donbass. This is the outcome that's already unfolding.
The only question is how long it takes. And the longer it takes, the worse the outcome will be for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the United States.
Scenario 3, the worst case, escalation and direct NATO-Russia war. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night.
In this version, Ukraine's collapse is so rapid and so complete that the West ICS. The US and NATO, desperate to avoid a total Russian victory, escalate their involvement.
They impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
They send in troops. They strike Russian targets inside Russia.
And then? Russia retaliates.
Not with nuclear weapons, at least, not at first, but with cyber attacks, sabotage, and targeted strikes on NATO supply lines.
The war spreads. Poland or the Baltics are drawn in. And suddenly, we're in a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. This is the scenario that the hawks think they can control. But they're wrong.
Because once the shooting starts, no one controls the escalation ladder. The grand strategy: how America lost the 21st century.
Let's out for a moment. Because this war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. And on that front, the United States is losing. For the past 30 years, America has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony. The idea was the US would use its unmatched military and economic power to reshape the world in its own image. Democracy promotion. Regime change. NATO action.
The rules-based order. But here's the it didn't work. In the Middle East, America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives and left behind failed states, not democracies. In Europe, NATO action provoked Russia without making Europe safer. In Asia, China's rise has been met with containment strategies that have only accelerated its military buildup. And now, in Ukraine, we're seeing the final act of this failed strategy. The US assumed that it could arm Ukraine, sanction Russia, and wait for Putin to fall. But Russia didn't collapse.
It adapted. And now, the world is watching as America's credibility erodes. The real tragedy? It didn't have to be this way.
A realist foreign policy, one that recognized Russia's legitimate security concerns, that treated China as a peer competitor rather than an enemy, that focused on diplomacy over regime change, could have avoided this mess.
But realism has been out of fashion in Washington for decades. And now, we're paying the price. What should we do instead? A realist's playbook. So what's the alternative? How do we avoid catastrophe? First, accept reality. Ukraine is not going to win this war. The best we can hope for is a negotiated settlement that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty, even if it means territorial concessions. That's not surrender. That's strategy. Second, rebuild dead air. Second, rebuild deterrence, but not the way the Pentagon thinks.
The US has spent the last 2 decades chasing the mirage of full-spectrum dominance, pouring trillions into stealth fighters, carrier strike groups, and hypersonic missiles, all while ignoring the fundamentals. Deterrence isn't about having the most expensive toys, it's about having the right tools in the right places, and more importantly, convincing your adversaries that you're willing to use them. Right now, Russia, China, and even Iran look at America and see a superpower that's all bark and no bite. They see a country that talks tough but folds when the body bags start coming home. That perception is more dangerous than any missile gap. Let me explain why this matters. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, the Obama administration responded with sanctions and a token military presence in Eastern Europe. The message was, we'll make you pay, but we won't fight. Putin took note. 8 years later, he invaded Ukraine, calculating correctly that the West would arm Kyiv but stop short of direct intervention. Now, fast forward to 2024.
The US is still sending weapons, still imposing sanctions, still refusing to put boots on the ground. And what's Russia doing? It's grinding down Ukrainian forces, consolidating its gains, and preparing for the next phase.
If we don't change course, we're not just losing Ukraine, we're losing the ability to shape events anywhere. Here's the uncomfortable: America's military is optimized for the wrong kind of war. Since 9/11, we've been fighting insurgents in the desert, not peer competitors on a modern battlefield. Our force structure reflects that. We have 11 aircraft carriers, but Russia and China have developed hypersonic missiles that can sink them from 1,500 miles away. We have the best fifth-generation fighters in the world, but our adversaries have built integrated air defense systems that can swat them out of the sky. We have a global network of bases, but many of them are vulnerable to precision strikes. The Pentagon calls this anti-access/area denial, or A2/AD. I call it the end of American invulnerability. Now, what most people don't realize is that this shift didn't happen overnight. It's the result of decades of strategic miscalculation. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the US assumed it had a unipolar moment. We dismantled our Cold War-era defenses, slashed military budgets, and pivoted to counterinsurgency. Meanwhile, Russia and China watched, learned, and adapted. By the time the US woke up to the threat, it was too late. In 2014, Russia unveiled its Gerasimov Doctrine, a hybrid warfare strategy that blends conventional forces, cyberattacks, and disinformation. In 2015, China declared its Made in China 2025 plan, aiming to dominate key technologies like semiconductors and artificial intelligence. And in 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine proved that the era of American military dominance is over. So how do we rebuild deterrence? First, we need to stop pretending that we can fight two major wars at once. The 2018 National Defense Strategy acknowledged this reality, but the Pentagon's budget still reflects Cold War-era thinking. We need to shift resources from legacy systems to asymmetric capabilities: drones, cyber, electronic warfare, and long-range precision strikes. Second, we need to harden our critical infrastructure. Russia and China have already demonstrated their ability to disrupt our power grids, financial systems, and communications networks. If we can't protect our own homeland, how can we credibly deter attacks on our allies? Third, we need to rethink our alliances. NATO is a relic of the 20th century, designed to contain the Soviet Union. Today, it's a liability. Europe spends less than 2% of its GDP on defense, relying on the US to pick up the slack. Meanwhile, countries like Poland and the Baltic states are begging for more American troops, while Germany and France dither over whether to send Ukraine a few dozen tanks. This isn't burden sharing, it's free riding. If we're going to deter Russia, we need to either force Europe to pay its fair share or reduce our commitments. And if we're going to contain China, we need to strengthen our alliances in Asia, not by exiting NATO to include Japan and South Korea, but by building a new framework that reflects the realities of the 21st century. Finally, we need to accept that diplomacy isn't weakness. The establishment treats negotiations as surrender, but that's a child's view of statecraft. Every great power in history, from Rome to Britain to the US, has used diplomacy to buy time, divide enemies, and secure its interests. Right now, we're doing the opposite. We're isolating Russia, pushing it closer to China, and leaving ourselves with no off-ramps. That's not strategy, that's stubbornness. Let's take a step back. The war in Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. And right now, that order is being rewritten not by America, but by Russia and China. They're not trying to replace the US as the global hegemon. They're trying to create a multipolar world where no single power dominates. And if we're not careful, they're going to succeed. The question: what are we going to do about it? Are we going to double down on a failed strategy of liberal hegemony, or are we going to adapt to the new reality? The clock is ticking. And the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to turn the tide. Now, what most people don't realize is that this geopolitical shift isn't happening in a vacuum. It's being driven by domestic political realities in both Russia and the West, and those realities are reinforcing each other in ways that make the current trajectory almost irreversible unless we act decisively.
Let me break this down, because the domestic dimension is where the real battle is being fought, and where the West is losing ground fastest. First, let's talk about Russia. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that Putin is a dictator clinging to power, that his regime is fragile, and that economic sanctions or military setbacks will eventually force him to the negotiating table, or better yet, trigger his downfall. This is wishful thinking at best, dangerous delusion at worst. The reality is that Putin's grip on power is stronger today than it was before the war, and not just because of repression. He successfully framed this conflict as an existential struggle against Western encroachment, and that narrative is resonating with a critical mass of the Russian population. Take the recent regional elections in September 2023. Despite the war, despite the mobilization, despite the economic strain, United Russia, the Kremlin's party, won over 80% of the vote in many regions. Now, I'm not naive, I know Russia's elections aren't free or fair. But the fact that the regime didn't even need to falsify results on a massive scale tells you something. The opposition is either in exile, in prison, or co-opted. The oligarchs who might have challenged Putin are either dead, like Prigozhin, or have been bought off. And the Russian people? Many of them genuinely believe that this is a defensive war against NATO action, that Ukraine is a puppet of the West, and that Russia is fighting for its survival. That's not just propaganda, it's a worldview that's been cultivated for decades, and it's not going to disappear overnight. Here's the uncomfortable: Putin doesn't need to win the war in Ukraine to win politically. He just needs to avoid losing. As long as the front lines don't collapse, as long as Russian cities aren't being bombed, as long as the economy doesn't implode, he can spin any outcome as a victory. A frozen conflict? That's a win, it keeps Ukraine out of NATO and maintains Russian influence. A negotiated settlement? That's a win, it forces the West to recognize Russia's security concerns. Even a partial withdrawal could be framed as a strategic retreat to consolidate gains. The Russian people have a high tolerance for suffering if they believe the cause is just, and right now, they do. Now, contrast that with the West. Our domestic politics are a mess, and that mess is undermining our ability to respond effectively. Let's start with Europe. The continent is deeply divided, not just between hawks and doves, but between those who see Russia as an existential threat and those who see it as a manageable nuisance. Germany is the perfect example. Olaf Scholz's government is paralyzed by infighting. The Greens want to send more weapons to Ukraine, the SPD is hesitant, the FDP is worried about the economy. The result? Germany dithers while Russia advances. And it's not just Germany. France is distracted by domestic unrest, Italy is led by a government that's historically friendly to Moscow, and the UK is too busy with its own political chaos to lead. The problem isn't just political will, it's political survival. European leaders are terrified of their own publics. Take the energy crisis. In 2022, European governments spent over €700 billion subsidizing energy costs to prevent social unrest. That's money that could have gone to defense, to Ukraine, or to rebuilding Europe's industrial base. But instead, it was spent on short-term band-aids because no leader wanted to risk mass protests. And now, as the war drags on, that fatigue is setting in. Polls show that support for Ukraine is declining across Europe, especially in countries like Germany and France. The longer this goes on, the harder it will be for European governments to justify continued aid. Then there's the United States. Our domestic politics are even more dysfunctional. The Biden administration is trapped between a rock and a hard place. On one side, you have the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is increasingly vocal about opposing military aid to Ukraine. On the other, you have the Republican Party, which is split between traditional hawks like Mitch McConnell and isolationists like Donald Trump. The result? A Congress that can barely pass a budget, let alone a long-term strategy for Ukraine. And let's not forget the elephant in the 2024 election. If Trump or another America First candidate wins, all bets are off. Trump has already said he'd end the war in 24 hours, code for cutting a deal with Putin that would leave Ukraine at Russia's mercy. Here's why this matters. Russia's strategy is built on endurance. They know the West is divided, they know our attention SS are short, and they know that time is on their side.
Every day that the war continues, the political pressure on Western leaders to find an off-ramp increases. And every day that pressure increases, the likelihood of a bad deal, one that rewards Russian aggression, goes up.
That's not speculation, it's history. Look at the Minsk agreements. Look at the Iran nuclear deal. Look at Vietnam. The West always starts strong, but we lose our nerve when the costs mount. Russia knows this, and they're betting on it. So what does this mean for the future? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios, none of them particularly optimistic.
The first scenario is the most a frozen conflict. The war grinds on for years, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow.
Ukraine holds most of its territory, but Russia keeps Crimea and parts of the Donbass. The West continues to provide just enough aid to keep Ukraine fighting, but not enough to win.
Europe remains divided, the US gets distracted by China, and eventually, a negotiated settlement is reached, one that leaves Russia in control of significant Ukrainian territory.
This is the scenario that Putin wants. It's not a total victory, but it's a victory nonetheless.
It shows that Russia can defy the West, that NATO is weak, and that the US can't be relied upon. And it sets the stage for the next crisis, whether in Moldova, the Baltics, or the Arctic.
The second scenario is a Ukrainian collapse. This is less likely, but not impossible. If Western aid dries up either because of political infighting in the US or fatigue in Europe, Ukraine could run out of ammunition, manpower, and will to fight.
Russia would then be able to dictate terms, possibly even installing a puppet government in Kiev.
This would be a catastrophic outcome for the West.
It would embolden Russia, demoralize our allies, and prove that aggression pays. It would also send a message to China that the US can't be trusted to defend its partners, which could accelerate a Taiwan crisis.
The consequences would be felt for decades. The third scenario is a Western awakening. This is the least likely, but not impossible. It would require a fundamental shift in how the West thinks about this war. Instead of treating it as a regional conflict, we'd have to treat it as an existential struggle for the future of the international order. That would mean Europe finally meeting its 2% defense spending target, not in 2027, but now. It would mean the US ramping up military production to Cold War levels. It would mean a full economic mobilization, not just sanctions, but a real effort to cripple Russia's war machine.
And it would mean a diplomatic offensive to peel away Russia's allies, starting with China.
But here's this scenario only works if the West is united, and right now, we're not. The political will simply isn't there. European publics are more concerned about inflation than about Ukraine. American voters are more worried about the border than about NATO. And our leaders are too afraid of the political costs to take the hard decisions that are needed. So where does that leave us? In a very dangerous place.
The most likely outcome is that we muddle through, that we avoid a total Ukrainian collapse but fail to secure a decisive victory. And that's the worst of both worlds. It leaves Russia in a stronger position than it was before the war, it leaves Ukraine in a state of perpetual instability, and it leaves the West looking weak and divided. The question: can we change course? Can we break out of this cycle of half measures and wishful thinking? The answer depends on whether we're willing to confront some hard truths. The first truth is that this war is not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of the international order. The second truth is that we can't win this war on the cheap. We either commit fully, or we lose. The third truth is that our domestic politics are not an excuse for inaction, they're the reason we're losing. The clock is ticking. And every day we wait, the cost of victory goes up.